Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young Kim. North Korean troops shot dead a South Korean civilian and government employee who crossed the maritime border between the two countries. A day after South Korea strongly condemned the killing as an act of brutality, North Korea sent a formal notice that conveyed leader Kim Jong-un's message that he feels sorry. We'll discuss these and more. Joining us today is Mark Tokola, Vice President of the Korea Economic Institute of America. He has over 38 years of experience in the U.S. Department of State, where he served as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He's a Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korea foreign policy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Let's go through what are known so far. A 47-year-old official affiliated with South Korea's Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries disappeared from the 499-ton boat on Monday, and North Korean soldiers shot and killed him while he was drifting at sea. Mr. Tokola, what did you pay attention to when you first heard about the news?
Well, the first question I had was, where was he? And then second was, why was he there? Because it seemed very significant if this happened in North Korean waters or not. The second question was, what actually happened?
Mr. Snyder, what are the other facts you carefully looked into?
Well, what I thought was really striking was that he was found 38 kilometers away from the place where he fell off the ship in the course of a little bit more than 24 hours. And that is a long way to travel. In that period of time. Either the currents were exceptionally strong or there's something else that we don't know. Certainly he had knowledge about the currents, and I think that could have been helpful. And then I think the other thing is that the initial report of the way in which he died was just so shocking that I think it grabbed everybody's attention and made a big emotional impact.
Mm-hmm. South Korean authorities first said that after the official was killed, his body was doused with oil and set on fire. However, North Korea's explanation seems to be quite different. Mr. Snyder, how was it different from what was initially known?
Well, I think that the initial reports, because of the time lag between discovery of the person by the North Korean military and the killing, it made it sound like a premeditated execution. Whereas the North Korean version of events kind of makes it more sound like this is an individual who failed to identify himself and then unfortunately ran into the wrong end of a border security protocol. So I think there's a pretty drastic difference in the narrative that we heard from the South Korean government side versus the way the North Korean government presented it.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Tokola, can we take North Korea's explanation at face value?
I wouldn't. We can't say for sure. The idea that he was reaching for something, so it might have been an act of self-defense, we'll never know. There will be no independent investigation. And I doubt if North Koreans will change their story. So we'll have to kind of see where we go from here. We may never know what actually happened.
Why would North Korean soldiers kill somebody who is floating on an object in the sea? They would think that it is difficult for him to attack them in that circumstance. Mr. Tokola, do you think this violates the international law?
Yeah, for the reason that they might have shot him, we've heard reports that North Korea does have a shoot-to-kill order along the border with China to prevent people from coming into the country potentially with COVID-19. I wasn't sure if that shoot-to-kill order applied everywhere. But on the question of international law, I don't want to get into legal hair splitting over what's a human tragedy, but it depends on what you consider the state of the Korean Peninsula to be today. Is it a state in conflict or is it a state at peace? And believe it or not, after all this time, that's still not legally clear. Now, judging by Moon Jae-in's comments that there needs to be an end of war declaration, you could argue plausibly that the conflict still exists. And if that's true, then the shooting is absolutely a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention on Treatment of Civilians.
Many human rights activists released statements criticizing North Korea. How could we approach this incident as a human rights aspect?
From the human rights side, you're not allowed to shoot migrants into a country outright. That's a violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But even if Kim Jong-un apologized and said this was a mistake, that soldiers overreacted, it's still a situation North Korea is shooting people trying to leave North Korea. That's a clear violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Instead, citizens have a right to leave their country.
Mr. Snyder, how does the July 2000 incident where a South Korean civilian tourist was shot dead in North Korea compare to this one?
Well, I do think that the 2008 incident provides a baseline for judging whether or not North Korea's response is different this time. And the major difference that we see is that this escalated to the leadership level, and Kim Jong-un issued a statement of apology. And so that is a difference. I think that it puts a spotlight on the fact that when we face situations of crisis escalation, as we saw last June with the demolition of the liaison office, or in 2015 when we saw the guard post incident, Kim Jong-un is really the only firebreak in terms of generating an exit ramp for these kinds of situations. And so, on the one hand, it's good to see that there is a way of capping escalation and that the leader is attentive to it. But I think it's also disconcerting that the leader is the only firebreak.
Meanwhile, the South Korean government officials say the case does not appear to constitute a violation of an inter-Korean military tension reduction agreement signed on September 19th, 2018. Mr. Snyder, what is your view? Did it violate the agreement or not?
Well, from a technical perspective and a legalistic perspective, I think that we can say that the agreement itself was not directly violated, but it really was a violation of the spirit of the agreement. Because the purpose of the agreement was to reduce tensions, reduce risk, and presumably prevent the possibility of casualties or death. And yet we have a case here where tensions between the two sides and suspicions clearly resulted in death of a South Korean government official.
According to South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff, the South Korean victim was presumed to have jumped into the sea in a suspected attempt to defect to the North and had drifted into North Korean waters. However, the North Korean government officials described him as a trespasser rather than a defector. Mr. Tokola, what explains this gap?
Well, they don't know the motives. The North Koreans who were patrolling the area saw a man in the water. I'm sure they had no way of knowing whether he was intending to defect or was there by accident. So I'm not sure the motives really come into this. I'm not clear from the South Korean side either, why he took the steps that he did.
Mr. Snyder, would you like to add to this?
The main thing that I would add is that the fact that we see this casualty, as Mark has indicated earlier, it tells us something about North Korean attitudes on border security that I think reveals the underlying character of the regime. And that is precisely what needs to be changed.
Just a day after a strong condemnation by the South Korean government, North Korea sent a formal notice. And through this notice, Chairman Kim Jong-un conveyed that he feels very sorry. Mr. Tokola, could we interpret this as Kim Jong-un's public apology?
It looks to me like more of an apology than we've seen North Korea for almost anything. So I do take it as an apology. But to me, the question is not whether it ends here. The question is what happens next. If Kim Jong-un wants to apologize and take this seriously, next steps could include holding accountable those who carried out this action, if he thinks it was a violation of orders. And second, they could pay compensation to the family, which the Fourth Geneva Convention would call for in this case. If he took those further steps, that would be impressive.
Mr. Snyder, some people see this as a very unusual move for a North Korean leader, but was it really?
Well, I think it was unusual to have the leader express that something went wrong on the North Korean side. We usually see blame shifting from North Korea. But then we have to ask, why is this the case? And I think that the interesting question is whether it suggests a higher degree of vulnerability by North Korea, the desire to control the risk of crisis escalation, and also it's interesting as an early response to an intense emotional outrage that was relatively quick by North Korean standards in terms of a direct response to an external stimulus.
Mr. Tokola, would it be possible to think that he made this move calculating the relationship with the U.S.?
I'm sure he had the U.S. in mind as well as South Korea. It didn't have to be one or the other. He may well have wanted to make an apology to influence both sides. This was almost certainly a mistake. It was not part of Kim Jong-un's calculation, whatever his calculation is. And I'm sure he was trying to limit the damage this would cause, which could have been substantial.
Mr. Snyder, do you have other thoughts as well?
No, I agree with that. I think that the really interesting development here is Kim Jong-un's own risk tolerance and what we're learning about it, both on this occasion and on other occasions. It suggests a certain level of vulnerability, and it may also suggest that he really wants to have his hand on the control when it comes to risk tolerance. These are externally imposed responses that Kim Jong-un is responding to, and so I think that that's notable.
Mm-hmm. And the South Korean presidential office suddenly made public that South Korean President Moon Jae-in and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un exchanged letters earlier this month. Mr. Snyder, why would they make this public now?
Well, I don't know, but I think that my impression is that the letters were released in order to try to help recover the humanization of Kim Jong-un as part of a response, and also to try to hold on to the possibility that was probably being pointed to in the exchange of letters of a restoration of inter-Korean dialogue and exchange.
The letter exchange took place before President Moon's recorded video message was released at the UN General Assembly. President Moon called on the UN member countries to work together on the declaration of the end to the Korean War. Mr. Tokola, what did you think about his message?
I have to say, when I first read it, it struck me as actually kind of uninteresting because it was not new. The Panmunjom Declaration of 2018 says that explicitly and in more detail. That both sides agree to reach an end-of-war declaration and to work towards a peace regime. So it sounded to me more like Moon Jae-in was just reminding Kim Jong-un of an obligation he'd already undertaken, rather than proposing anything new.
How will this incident affect the inter-Korean relationship, which has been a stalemate for quite a while now? Mr. Snyder.
Well, I think that remains to be seen, but I do believe that with the exchange of letters, that it's possible that the South Korean government is going to try to use this in order to push for a kind of turnaround or for potentially renewed momentum. And I think that that would only be possible in the context of Kim Jong-un's statement expressing contrition for loss of life. But it remains to be seen whether it's going to be possible to take the next step.
Mr. Tokola, your prospect on inter-Korean relationship?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Moon Jae-in is trying hard to get a relationship going. I mean, if there's any good to come out of this tragedy, it may be as it gives the two of them something to talk about. Communication is better than no communication. So as I said, if Kim Jong-un took advantage of this tragedy to promote relations by taking further steps, it could be the beginning of something positive.
My last question is whether this will have any impact on the U.S.-North Korean relationship. Mr. Tokola, first.
I don't think so. I think it would have made a difference if North Korea had not apologized. I think that actually makes a difference. I saw the State Department move to support South Korea in its call for a full explanation for the incident. So now it looks like more of an inter-Korean issue than a U.S.-Korea issue because of Kim Jong-un's apology.
Mr. Snyder, your last thought?
I agree. No direct impact on the U.S.-North Korea relationship, but we are learning that Kim Jong-un really enjoys having pen pals now that Moon has been added to his list along with Trump.
I have to say I regret that a little bit. It used to be that presidential letters or letters between heads of government were one way of communicating, confidentially. In my career, I used to deal with presidential correspondence, and it was always classified because heads of government need to communicate with each other. Now that the Woodward book made the Trump-Kim letters public, now they're seeing the Moon-Kim letters becoming public, it looks to me like it closes off one useful means of communication.
Many questions are still unanswered over the death of the South Korean civilian in the North Korean territory. The whole truth of what really happened to him should be uncovered through a continued investigation and should be clearly known to the public. Mr. Tokola and Mr. Snyder, thank you both very much. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Youngya.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.